Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS legal hotline lawyer. And this video is one of those in the series covering the revisions to the statewide forms released on March 3rd, 2021. This video is going to discuss Form 22A, the financing contingency. And the most significant change to the financing contingency is the inclusion of additional option that creates two different, very different types of financing contingency. Under our pre-March 3rd statewide form system financing contingency, buyer and seller only had one option for a financing contingency. And that financing contingency effectively gave buyer a financing contingency that stretched all the way to closing. And the only way that financing contingency would ever be cut off shorter than closing was if seller delivered what was known as a Notice of Right to Terminate, Form 22AR. If seller delivered the 22AR, Notice of Right to Terminate, then buyer would have 3 days to waive their financing contingency. If buyer didn't waive the financing contingency, then seller could but was not required to terminate. If you like that style of financing contingency, is still available to you in Form 22A, Paragraph 2, Option A. And in fact, there's a check mark box for selecting either Option A or Option B. If you don't mark any of the boxes, it will default to Option A, and buyer will have the old style of financing contingency. The only revisions to that concept, and these are not substantive revisions, is that the 22AR, what used to be called the Notice of Right to Terminate that seller would deliver, is now called the Notice to Perform. Substantively, the form is identical to what it used to be. It's just entitled with a different caption, Notice to Perform, rather than Notice of Right to Terminate. Buyer's still got 3 days to decide what they're going to do. If buyer doesn't waive the financing contingency, seller can terminate the transaction if they choose. The only other change is to reduce the default number of days for which, by when seller can deliver the 22AR. Used to be 30 days by default. It's now 21 days. But again, the parties can agree to any number of days they want. That's a default term. Option B is a completely different philosophy for financing contingencies. Option B mirrors every other contingency in the statewide form system, and by that I mean it automatically terminates or expires, waives, whatever word you like, on a date agreed by the parties. So by default, it is 21 days after mutual acceptance. And if you accepted that, then if buyer was an Option B, a Form 22A, Paragraph 2, Option B financing contingency buyer, then 21 days following mutual acceptance, buyer's financing contingency would automatically waive. Seller doesn't deliver a notice, buyer doesn't have any chance to change that outcome. On day 21, buyer's financing contingency waives. Prior to waiver, buyer can terminate the purchase and sale agreement. However, buyer only recovers their earnest money if buyer can provide the lender letter demonstrating buyer's good faith effort to obtain financing. This is the same lender letter that was required under the old version of Form 22A. The description of what's required in the lender letter hasn't changed at all. Lender's letter has to identify the date on which buyer made loan application, has to have been within 5 days of mutual acceptance, that buyer had sufficient funds to close the transaction had the loan been issued, and number 3, the reason the loan funds are unavailable. Now I want you to think about this in the context of Option B. If we were still in Option A and we got all the way to the closing date and buyer's loan didn't issue, it's pretty easy then for lender to say, well, this is why it didn't issue. And it could even be that the lender ran out of time processing the loan. You can't rely on that if buyer has to terminate the transaction before you ever get to the closing date and deliver this letter to justify why buyer's loan funds would not have been available on the closing date in the future. What does that mean? It means, buyer brokers, buyer has got to get an underwriting approval or denial prior to to the automatic waiver date of their option B financing contingency. So realistically, what does that mean to you, buyer broker? It means that you have to help your buyer understand absolutely how important it is that, number one, they hire a competent lender. Cannot be overstated. They've got to hire a competent lender, somebody who knows how to get the loan processed timely. Number two, buyer has to get all of their documentation that lender requires delivered to lender immediately upon lender's request, no delay. And then number three, buyer and buyer broker, you're going to have to press buyer's lender to get that loan package assembled and submitted to the underwriter as soon as possible, because buyer has got to get either a thumbs up or a thumbs down from this underwriter in time, buyer broker, for you to deliver a notice of termination based on the financing contingency to seller if buyer's loan is denied. You're going to have that information from the underwriter so that lender can then write a letter showing the date of application, that buyer had sufficient funds, and that buyer's loan would not have issued on the closing date because it was denied by the underwriter for whatever reason they account for. Those are the big changes. With both option A and option B, buyer can still retain the protection of the low appraisal provision. In fact, the default now, if you don't mark any boxes on the preservation of low appraisal provision, which in option A is small Roman numeral 3 and option B it's small Roman numeral 2, if you don't mark any boxes, then the default is for preservation of the low appraisal provision, meaning that if buyer waives the financing contingency and you don't mark any boxes, or if you do mark a box, you mark the will not box, then with that, buyer does retain the protection of the low appraisal provision. Okay, there were a few other changes to the financing contingency, but that's the big one. Everything else was effectively boilerplate changes. If you have questions on the new financing contingency or anything else, send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington Realtor member.